Hey guys, so quick and easy tutorial for a wave spawner. This wave spawner allows you to set the number of rounds, the types of enemies you want to spawn per round, the amount of each enemy, and the rate at which those enemies spawn. So it is almost a full-featured type of thing, and it's very easy to make. So first you want to create an empty game object called Game Master, and if you have only one spawn, like let's say for a simple tower defense map like I have here, I'm just going to put it inside the center of my spawning cube, and we're going to attach wave spawner script to it. Have your thing set up like this as a mono behavior. Then we're going to create a state machine using this enum here that I'm going to paste in. And this basically will be our spawn state. So we'll have the spawning state in which it'll start spawning the enemies. Our waiting state, which waits for the player to kill all the enemies, and our counting down state, which counts on the time in between each wave. Then we're going to have two system.serializable classes here. What the system.serializable thing here does is it allows us to change these values in the inspector. So that's very useful for, being able to change the amount of rounds. Then we're going to declare a whole bunch of variables here, which I'm going to explain very briefly. Creating an array of the class wave here. Let me explain these classes first. We have a name, and we have an array of this enemy's class here. This enemy's class contains the transform of the enemy, which is basically where a prefab is going to go into, the count of the enemy, and the rate at which the enemy spawn. And then we're creating an array of that. The wave count, time between waves, the wave countdown, and the search timer, which basically is going to be used later to say how often in seconds do you want the objects on the game to be searched to see if there's an enemy alive. You can make this shorter for more accuracy, but performance loss, and you can make it higher for less accuracy but higher performance, but at some point you get diminishing returns. 1 second is usually enough. And we're setting our spawn state here, so when the script first gets initialized, it's down on counting, so that everything will work. In our start method here, we're gonna have wave countdown equals time between waves. We're setting this to this. Simple as that. Then in our update function here, we're gonna create our first if-then statements, which will be used to determine what happens everywhere. If the state up here, which is spawn state, and that gets declared as spawn state equals spawn state.counting. So we're basically setting spawn state as a variable state, and it just makes life a bit easier, so we don't have to keep writing spawn state. If state is waiting, and if the boolean that gets returned by this method is not true, then we'll begin a new round. Otherwise, we'll return. And I'll explain once we finally implement that method. If the wave countdown is less than 0, and if the state is not spawning currently, then we're going to start our coroutine. This is basically a timed method, and this is going to be what starts our IE enumerator. Otherwise, keep decreasing the wave countdown. And this time.delta time is a pretty good way of making sure that that countdown's accurate. I still don't know why this extra thing up here. Okay, so we're gonna have our void begin new round method now. And this is what gets called up here. Wave completed, state, spawn state.counting. So when it begins a new round, it'll start counting down. When the wave countdown, and then set the wave countdown back to time between waves. And the reason that we have this time between waves variable here is just so we can keep setting the wave countdown back. This never actually gets used, this is the one that gets used. This is basically going to be what sets this. And if the number next wave here is greater than waves.length minus 1, and we're subtracting by 1 here because indexing starts at 0 and .length kind of does some weird indexing stuff, then we're going to set the next wave to 0. This will basically say, okay, this is the wave you're going to spawn now. You're going to start all the way back from the first wave and keep going. So if you have 2 waves and the second one's completed, right now the code will restart the first wave. This isn't ideal, as that's not how a tower defense game works, and you can easily add some button and start-stop GUI logic here. Otherwise, increment the wave number. Here's going to be our boolean that returns if there's an enemy alive on screen, and this is where our search timer value comes in. This is basically allowing us, because the update method gets called every frame, this here kind of allows it to be called every second, which is just a lot less intensive, especially if you're playing this game at a high frame rate. It'll just be a less of a performance tank. It's 1 second no matter what. And if game objects dot find object with tag with the enemy tag is null, then you can return false, and you can give your enemies any tag here. But right now, there's gonna be some errors here right now. But right now, mine have the enemy tag. If there is one, return false. Otherwise, return true. And if it returns false here, then the opposite. So if it's null, it will return false, and it will become opposite. So it will be true. If it's true, it'll begin a new round. Otherwise, if it's true, then it'll become false. It's kind of counterintuitive, but that's the way I coded it. Next, we're gonna make our IEnumerator here, which is most of the logic. And this is a lot of code here, so I'm gonna explain this the best way I can. We have our IEnumerator with the name spawn wave. And we're taking in our wave parameter here, which is this class. And we're just giving it a variable, arbitrary variable, underscore wave, which is easy enough. Then we're gonna log the name of the wave here. And that comes from wave.name. Right? Then we're gonna have our state to spawning, because obviously this will start spawning our enemies. For int I equals 0, I is less than wave.enemies.length I++. Let me explain this. As you can see here, we have an array of this class enemy called enemies. Each of these classes takes in a transform, a count, and a rate. This for loop here is going to iterate through all combinations of these. So every single group of a transform, count, and rate together. That's what the for loop is going to iterate. Then we're going to create a temporary variable. Not really, it's just going to be called temp, which is underscore wave.enemies with index of I. Then we're going to do for j equals 0, j is less than temp.count j++. What this is doing is it's saying enemies, right? Enemies down here. And we're saying, okay, look at the count. This count is going to be set to whatever number you set it to, and it'll keep incrementing. And it'll keep going until all the enemies have been spawned. So if you set the count to 10, and you have 2 enemies, this will iterate, okay, first enemy 0, because it starts at 0, you know? Then it'll spawn 10 of them. And then your second enemy, let's say you have 5, it'll go, okay, I is now 1. Now we'll spawn 5 of these, because it'll say, okay, that's the next one. We'll fire our spawn enemy method here. Yield return new wait for seconds. Basically, this is just gonna make our IEnumerator actually not instantly spawn everything, and actually have some cooldown in between spawning, because, you know, it'd be really unfair if every enemy spawned at once, and it would just be almost impossible to beat. And we're gonna set our spawn state here to waiting after everything's spawned. Our last method here is our spawn enemy, and this is what actually does the spawning. This takes in a transform parameter, which we get here from our temp.enemy transform. And as you know, temp is basically just another way of accessing this class here. And this will give us our enemy transform object. We're passing that is as underscore enemy variable. Instantiate is basically just going to take a copy and place it in our scene with transform.position and transform.rotation. That basically is going to be the location and rotation of this empty game object here, which is why I placed it inside of our spawn. Then we're going to say spawning enemy name. Now all this code is done, I'm going to show you how everything works. So as you see here now, we have this little waves drop down thing in the inspector. I'm going to type in two waves for now. You can give it, so you can say round 1, and here you can say round 2. Right? Rounds 2. Then now I see it says list as enemy because we have no enemies here. So if I set this to 2, and I set this one to 2 as well, you see how these get created? This is because whenever I set this to 2, whenever I set the number of enemies to 2, it's going to create 2 versions of this class, each with their own transform count and rate. And the reason I can create multiple waves is because this thing here is creating multiple versions of this class, each that contain a version of this class in it. Or an array of those classes, rather. Now what we can do is we can set our transform. So I have 2 pre-made prefabs here. And let's say we want to spawn in 10 basic bubbles with a rate of 10. So basically, one will spawn in every 10th of a second. And here we'll spawn in maybe 5 fast bubbles at a rate of, let's say 10 again. And here we'll do the same thing, but we'll just do both fast bubbles, right? It'll be a harder one. This is just for a proof of concept. Oh crap. I'll actually do basic bubbles here instead. Let's do 5 and maybe a rate of 20. 20 and 50. And I'm quickly just going to set the speed to like 20 and the speed to like 50 just to make it run faster. So now essentially what we've done here is we've had our bubble prefabs or enemy prefabs, whatever, and the count and the rate, which is when this script gets activated, it'll start iterating through the enemy array first. So it'll iterate, oh, found enemy here. Then it'll be like jump to here, dot count. So now it'll start spawning count number of times, in this case 10, everything. So I'll just show you now. So as you can see, when you start, this wave countdown is going to start counting down, and then bam, our enemies are going to start spawning in. 5 fast ones, as we said here, and 10 of these slow ones, as you can see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. When all of these get destroyed, it should start counting down again, and this will now spawn wave 2 with 20 fast bubbles and 5 basic ones. So let's see. That looks like about 20, and that's 5 of these. And they'll spawn in instant succession. Once these are done spawning, the next one will start spawning. And then I'll show you what happens when you're out of waves. But right now, it'll start counting down again. And it'll spawn round 1. And in our console here, you'll see object, basic bubble, fast bubble, spawning wave round 1, wave completed, and it just gives you some useful information here. So I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial, and I hope it helps you out.